In the summer of 1994, Formula One rewrote its own technical regulations in the middle of a season. In a matter of weeks, under emergency conditions, with cars already built and championships already underway, one of those rushed rules ended up disqualifying the eventual world champion from a race he had already won. He went on to take the title by a single point. Formula One does not do this. The sport writes regulations years in advance, precisely so that teams can design against a fixed target. Changing the rules while the season is running is close to the most disruptive thing the governing body can do. It has just done it again. So it is worth understanding what happened the last time the sport tore up its own rulebook mid-season, because the consequences of those 8 weeks were not the ones anybody intended. To understand 1994, you have to start at the end of 1993. By then, Formula One cars had become the most technologically sophisticated racing machines ever built, and a growing number of people inside the sport thought that was a problem. Active suspension could read the circuit and adjust ride height continuously. Traction control managed wheel spin. Anti-lock braking managed lockups. Launch control handled the start. The Williams FW15C, which took Alain Prost to the 1993 title, was so comprehensively assisted that the debate about how much of the lap the driver was actually doing had become a genuine one. The counter-argument was straightforward. Formula One was supposed to be a driving contest, and the electronics were expensive enough that they were pulling the field apart. The teams who could afford the best software were simply gone. So for 1994, the FIA banned essentially all of it. Active suspension, traction control, anti-lock brakes, four-wheel steering, launch control, gone. Refueling during races was reintroduced at the same time, which changed strategy completely and put fuel rigs back in pit lanes for the first time since 1983. The effect on the cars was immediate and, in hindsight, badly underestimated. Teams had designed 1993 cars around suspension systems that no longer existed. The 1994 cars inherited that aerodynamic philosophy without the technology that made it work. The result was a generation of cars that were nervous, that rode badly, and that were unforgiving in a way the previous generation simply had not been. Drivers said so, publicly and before a wheel had turned in anger. Ayrton Senna, who had left McLaren for Williams over the winter to drive what was supposed to be the dominant car, was among the most vocal. He described the season ahead as one that would be difficult and, in his words, likely to feature a lot of accidents. That is where the 1994 season begins, not with a rule change made mid-season, with a rule change made before the season, whose consequences the sport had not fully modeled. Round 1, Brazil. Senna took pole, he led, and chasing a young Benetton driver named Michael Schumacher, he spun out of the race. Round 2, the Pacific Grand Prix at Aida in Japan. Senna took pole again. He was hit at the first corner and was out before the lap was complete. 2 races, 2 poles, 0 points. Schumacher had won both and led the championship 20 points to nothing. Beneath the results, something else was building. Senna had serious reservations about the handling of the Williams FW16, a car that was fast over a single lap and difficult over a race distance. He also had suspicions about the Benetton. He had listened to it on track, and he did not believe a car without traction control should sound the way that one did. He said so publicly. That accusation would go somewhere, just not for several months. Round 3 was the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola on the 1st of May. Before that weekend, Formula One had not lost a driver at a Grand Prix meeting since 1982, 12 years. An entire generation of the sport had come and gone under the assumption, never stated but universally held, that the cars had become survivable. On the Friday, Rubens Barrichello crashed heavily at the Variante Bassa. He was airlifted to hospital and he survived. On the Saturday, during qualifying, the Austrian driver Roland Ratzenberger suffered a front-wing failure at high speed. He did not survive. It was the first fatality at a Formula One race weekend in 12 years. On the Sunday, on the 7th lap of the Grand Prix, Ayrton Senna's car left the circuit at Tamburello. He died later that day. There were further injuries that weekend. Debris from a start-line collision injured spectators. A wheel came loose in the pit lane and injured mechanics. I am not going to dwell on the accidents themselves. They have been examined in exhaustive detail elsewhere, and this episode is about what the sport did next. What the sport did next was panic. And it is important to be precise about that word, because panic is not the same as failure. Within days, the FIA had committed to changing the technical regulations immediately, not for 1995, for the races that were still to come in 1994. The Grand Prix Drivers' Association, dormant for over a decade, was reconstituted at the very next race in Monaco. Senna had been part of discussions to revive it in the days before Imola. And at Monaco itself, in Thursday practice, Karl Wendlinger suffered a severe head injury and was left in a coma. He survived and eventually returned to racing. But 3 weekends into the sport's crisis, it had another driver in intensive care. Whatever the FIA was going to do, it now had to do it faster. This is the part of 1994 that gets skipped, and it is the part that matters. The FIA's objective was simple: reduce cornering speeds and reduce the risk of a car becoming airborne or losing downforce suddenly. Its problem was that it had 11 teams with cars already designed, already built, and already in service. The changes came in waves, race by race. The first wave arrived at the Spanish Grand Prix at the end of May, 4 weeks after Imola. Teams were required to cut downforce directly, front-wing end plate dimensions restricted, diffusers reduced in size. The target was a downforce reduction of around 15%, achieved not by a redesign, but by taking a knife to parts that already existed. The second wave came 2 weeks later, in Canada. There, the sport went after engine power, and the method it chose is the single best illustration of how fast this was happening. Teams were required to cut holes in the engine cover to spoil the airbox, reducing the pressure, feeding the engine, and with it, the power. That is not a regulation in any normal sense. That is a field modification, and you could see it from the grandstand. Cars arrived in Montreal with holes cut in their bodywork because the governing body had told them to make the engines worse. It was still not considered enough. By the German Grand Prix, the FIA had to issue a tighter definition of where those holes were permitted to go because teams had begun positioning them to minimize the damage. Then came the plank. From the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim at the end of July, every car had to run a 10-millimetre wooden skid block along the center of the floor. Wear was permitted, but only 1 millimetre. If the plank measured less than 9 at the end of a race, the car was illegal. The logic was elegant. Ground effect works best when the floor runs as close to the track as possible. You cannot easily police ride height directly, but you can bolt a piece of wood to the bottom of the car and measure it afterwards. If a team runs the car too low, the plank wears and the car fails inspection. It was a genuinely clever piece of regulation writing. It is still, in modified form, part of the rulebook today. And here is the detail that matters most. The plank had already been planned for 1995. It was a considered change, scheduled for a season when teams could design around it. Instead, it was pulled forward into the middle of a running championship, alongside smaller rear wings, and dropped onto cars that had been conceived 18 months earlier under a different set of assumptions. Nobody had modeled what it would do to a title fight. The teams were, predictably, in open conflict with the governing body. Redesigning aerodynamic surfaces mid-season is enormously expensive, and it does not affect every team equally. A car whose performance is built on high downforce loses more than a car that was never generating much in the first place. Several circuits were also modified on short notice. Temporary chicanes installed at high-speed corners at Barcelona, Montreal and Silverstone, among others. Some built from tyre stacks and concrete blocks in the days before the race. The 1994 season, from Spain onwards, was not really a single championship. It was a series of races run to a rulebook that kept moving. And here is where the rushed rules started deciding the championship. At Silverstone in July, Michael Schumacher overtook Damon Hill on the formation lap, a breach of procedure. He was given a 5-second stop-go penalty. It was not served. He was shown the black flag, which in Formula One means stop. Now, your race is over. He kept driving. What followed was chaos, of a distinctly administrative kind. Benetton told officials there had been a misunderstanding about the penalty. The stewards withdrew the black flag. Schumacher served the stop-go late and finished second on the road. He was disqualified from the race afterwards, stripped of 6 points, and following an appeal that delayed matters by several weeks, handed a 2-race ban that he ultimately served at Monza and Estoril. Meanwhile, the FIA had been examining Benetton's software. After Imola, it had demanded source code from Benetton, McLaren and Ferrari. Benetton and McLaren initially refused and were fined $100,000 each. When the code was finally analyzed, investigators found something hidden in the Benetton system. 10 program options were visible on screen. There was an 11th that was not, an unlisted routine reachable by anyone who knew where to put the cursor, which the analysts identified as launch control. It was catalogued as option 13. Benetton acknowledged the code existed and said it had been written for testing and could not be activated in a race. In late July, the FIA published its finding. There was no evidence the system had been used at Imola. No further penalty followed. That is where the matter formally rests, and this episode is not going to relitigate it. What is documented is that a banned system was found in the car, and that the governing body could not establish it had been switched on. And at Hockenheim, Jos Verstappen's Benetton caught fire during a pit stop when fuel was spilled across the car. Verstappen and 5 mechanics suffered burns. None were life-threatening. It emerged that a filter had been removed from the team's refueling equipment. The refueling that had only returned to Formula One that season as part of the pre-season rule change. And at Spa in August, Schumacher won the race. About 5 hours later, he was disqualified. The plank on the underside of his Benetton measured 8 millimeters. The regulation required 9. He had lost the race by 1 millimeter of wood. Benetton argued that the wear was the result of a spin over a curb. The stewards were not persuaded, and under the regulation as written, intent was irrelevant. The plank measured what it measured. 10 points, gone. From a rule that had existed for less than a month, and that had been scheduled for the following season. Between the Silverstone ban and the Spa disqualification, Michael Schumacher lost the equivalent of a substantial championship lead in the space of 6 weeks. Not on pace, and not in a single case because he had been outdriven. Damon Hill won 3 of the races Schumacher missed or lost, which is how Formula One arrived at the final round in Adelaide with 1 point separating them. Schumacher 92, Hill 91. Schumacher led. On lap 36, he went off the road and struck a wall. Damage Hill, following behind, could not see. As Hill moved to pass at the next corner, the 2 cars collided. Schumacher was out on the spot. Hill's suspension was damaged badly enough that his team retired the car a few laps later. Neither finished. Schumacher took the championship by a single point. The collision has been argued about for 30 years, and this episode is not going to settle it. What is not in dispute is the arithmetic. A championship decided by 1 point in a season where one competitor had been removed from 4 races by penalty, disqualification, and a ban, and where one of those disqualifications came from a technical rule that had been written in an emergency 10 weeks earlier. The plank was a good regulation. It is still in the sport today. It also almost certainly changed who won the 1994 World Championship. Formula One has changed regulations in seasons since. Technical directives get issued, clarifications get made, and the rulebook is a living document more often than the sport likes to admit. But a coordinated package of technical and sporting changes, agreed in an emergency meeting and introduced across the remainder of a running season, is rare. It happened in 1994 under the worst circumstances the sport has ever faced. And it has happened again this year. In April, following the opening races of the new regulation era, the FIA and all 11 teams agreed a set of adjustments to the 2026 rules, covering energy management in qualifying, race start procedures, and wet weather protocols, introduced from the Miami Grand Prix onwards. The concerns were the spectacle of qualifying and the closing speeds between cars. Whether those changes are the right ones is a question for the season to answer, and it is not one this channel is going to pretend to know. What 1994 offers is not a prediction. It is a warning about a specific failure mode. Rules written under time pressure solved the problem they were written for. The plank worked. Cornering speeds came down. Whatever else can be said about the FIA's response in 1994, 2 decades of Grand Prix followed without another driver fatality, the longest such run in the sport's history to that point. What rushed rules cannot do is account for their own second-order effects. The disqualification nobody foresaw, the championship swing nobody intended, the tolerance that turns out to matter more than anyone realized when it was drafted in 8 weeks in the middle of a season. The rulebook is never neutral, and when it changes its speed, it changes the result. This channel is telling the whole story of Formula One, season by season, from the very beginning, 1950, 13 cars at Silverstone, and 3 teammates in the same works team fighting for a championship that had never existed before. That story starts on the card on screen now. The full grid.